What if I told you that a growing number of American doctors, the same ones trained in Harvard, Stanford, and the Mayo Clinic, are now sending their own children to study medicine? Not in New York, not in London, but in the Philippines? At first glance, it almost feels like a mistake. Why would families with access to the most prestigious institutions in the world, families who know the inner workings of the American healthcare system, choose to send their children over 8,000 miles away to study medicine in a developing country? Isn't that going backward? And yet, they're doing it. Quietly, steadily, and for reasons far deeper than most of us might imagine. Dr. Stephen Lafferty never thought he'd cry over a university brochure. He's a pediatric surgeon based in Seattle, with 2 Ivy League degrees and a professional circle that includes some of the best minds in American medicine. His daughter, Emily, had just finished her undergraduate studies at UCLA, graduating with honors in biology. The path ahead seemed clear, a traditional route into medical school, followed by residency, and then a place in the hospital system her father had thrived in. But one evening, Stephen found himself sitting at the dinner table, staring at a pamphlet with a photo of a medical school building in Cebu. The campus didn't look like Johns Hopkins. The infrastructure wasn't gleaming or state-of-the-art, but something about the letter attached to that pamphlet, a handwritten note from a Filipino dean who had personally called Emily a future servant of humanity, struck him deeply. There was sincerity in it, a kind of warmth he hadn't seen in years. "You don't belong in a machine," the dean had written. "You belong where your hands will heal and your heart will remain whole." Stephen had laughed at first. He thought it was cute, maybe even a bit naive. But his daughter didn't laugh. She stared at the letter for a long time, and then she asked her father a question he hadn't expected. "Dad, when did medicine stop feeling human to you?" That night, something shifted. He remembered his early years as a young resident, full of energy, hope, and dreams. He remembered why he fell in love with medicine in the first place: to help people, to heal the sick, to sit beside grieving families and offer them not just knowledge, but presence. But years in the system had dulled that spirit. Paperwork had replaced patience. Metrics had replaced meaning. Stephen began to ask around, quietly, cautiously, just a few trusted colleagues at first. To his surprise, more than one whispered the same thing. "My son's studying in the Philippines. My niece is at St. Luke's. My daughter's in Davao, and she's thriving." He realized there was a quiet movement already happening, hidden beneath the surface, spoken only in personal conversations and late-night calls between doctors who felt something missing in the very system they had helped build. So he booked a flight with Emily. They landed in the Philippines on a humid Monday morning. Emily's first breath of the country was filled with jeepney fumes, the sound of tricycles, and the unmistakable noise of a world that felt alive. But more than the chaos, what surprised her was the kindness. Strangers smiled. Security guards offered directions without being asked. When she and her father got lost on the university campus, it was a janitor who walked them to the admissions office, slowly, carefully, as if he had all the time in the world. Stephen kept watching. The facilities weren't as advanced. Some of the classrooms still used chalkboards. But the students? They were different. They weren't racing toward prestige. They were grounded, grateful, a little more human somehow. One young woman, a second-year med student from Manila, told Emily during orientation, "Here, we don't just study medicine. We live with the people. We visit mountain clinics. We treat kids who've never seen a doctor. You don't just learn the science, you learn the soul." That line stayed with Emily for days. Later, when they visited a rural health outreach center supported by the university, Stephen saw his daughter kneel on a dirt floor beside a crying mother and her feverish baby. There was no medical bag, no equipment, just her hand gently placed on the woman's shoulder and a soft voice that said, "You're not alone. Stephen felt something rise in his chest, a kind of ache. It was both painful and beautiful. This was what he had once known. This was what medicine used to feel like. When they returned to the hotel that evening, Emily didn't ask for his advice. She simply said, "I'm staying." Stephen didn't argue, but he did write a letter of his own that night, to the dean, thanking him. And then another, to a close friend back home, also a physician, urging him to consider looking at the Philippines, not as an alternative, but as a restoration. He realized something deeply uncomfortable, yet undeniable. The system he had worked so hard to succeed in was no longer the one he trusted to shape his daughter's soul. He wasn't alone. And this quiet, emotional migration of faith is only the beginning of a much bigger story. A story that's still unfolding in unexpected ways. Emily thought she knew what she was getting into. She had read the forums, watched the videos, even spoken to a few Filipino students online. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for her first week of classes in Cebu. It wasn't just the tropical humidity clinging to her every morning walk, or the occasional brownout in the middle of a lecture. It wasn't the cafeteria food that tasted foreign, or the jeepney rides that felt like mini roller coasters. It was something deeper, a feeling, like being dropped into a world where time moved differently, where people were in no rush, yet everything somehow got done. On the third day, while walking to class, she passed by an elderly man slowly sweeping the school grounds with a handmade walis ting-ting. He looked up, gave her a wide, toothless smile, and said, "Magandang umaga, hija." She had no idea what it meant, but his eyes were kind. That morning she learned it meant, "Good morning, daughter." Daughter, not student, not foreigner. Daughter. That word stayed with her. In America, she had spent years trying to stand out. Perfect grades, perfect scores, endless competition. But here, people seemed to see her not as a resume, but as a person. She was called Hija by her professors, Ate by younger students, even Anak by the school nurse, who handed her a warm bowl of arroz caldo the day she came down with a cold. The medical curriculum was no joke. Classes were intense, the workload demanding. Anatomy labs began early and ended late. And yet, there was no sharp edge to it. Her professors didn't try to break her down. They spoke with a gentleness she hadn't expected. During one particularly grueling exam week, her pharmacology teacher ended class early and simply said, "You need rest more than you need more information. Take care of your mind." She thought of her professors back in the States. Brilliant, yes, but distant, robotic, and exhausted. No one had ever said something like that to her before, and it wasn't just the faculty. One afternoon, while volunteering at a free clinic in the outskirts of town, Emily found herself standing beside a third-year Filipino student named Angelo. They were assisting a doctor who was treating a farmer with a deep machete wound. The clinic had no electricity that day, no air conditioning, only natural light filtering in through slats in the wall. As the wound was being cleaned, the man winced and clutched Emily's hand, tears streaming down his face. Angela whispered softly in Bisaya, comforting the man with a voice full of empathy. Later, when the patient was stable, Emily turned to Angelo and asked, "How do you do that? Stay so calm?" Angelo looked at her, then down at his hands, stained with gauze and iodine. "We were raised to see pain, Ate," he said quietly, "not just to treat it, to sit with it." That one sentence changed something in her. Back home, her pre-med friends obsessed over MCAT scores and internships with world-class surgeons. They dreamed of hospitals with glass elevators and robotic arms. But here, in this humble clinic with plastic chairs and handheld fans, Emily saw something far more sacred, human dignity, the kind of dignity that didn't depend on modern tools or fancy titles, just presence, just being there. Her transformation wasn't dramatic. It was slow, like water reshaping stone. Every patient she met, every child she held, every elder she listened to, they all became teachers. And the lessons weren't always comfortable. There were days she cried. Quietly, in her dorm room, when the heat felt too much or the homesickness too heavy. There were days she doubted herself, especially when language barriers made her feel small. But each time, someone reminded her that struggle wasn't failure. It was formation. Once, during a medical mission in Bohol, a grandmother with a hunched back and calloused hands took both of Emily's palms and pressed them to her forehead. A gesture of respect. "Salamat, doctora," the woman whispered. Emily wasn't even a doctor yet. She didn't feel like she deserved that word, but in that moment, it wasn't about titles or degrees. It was about intention. The woman saw her heart. Stephen watched from afar as his daughter changed. He visited a few months in, curious to see if the shine had worn off. But instead, he found her more grounded than ever. Her face had a calmness, her voice a depth. She had stories now, not of lab scores or honors lists, but of people. Real people. He joined her one day on campus and noticed how she greeted the janitors by name, how she bowed her head gently when speaking to elders. She wasn't just learning medicine. She was learning a way of life. That evening, over dinner at a small carinderia, Stephen asked her, "Do you ever regret not going the traditional path?" Emily looked at him, spooning some adobo onto her plate. She smiled. "Dad, I used to want to wear a white coat because it meant success. Now I want to wear it because it means service." Stephen said nothing. He just nodded. Because, deep down, he knew his daughter had become the kind of doctor he had always hoped to be, and he wasn't the only parent who felt this shift. Back in the States, a quiet ripple was spreading. One family after another, physicians, educators, even former skeptics, were beginning to reconsider what medical education should really look like, not just as a pipeline to prestige, but as a pathway to purpose. And the Philippines? It was no longer seen as a second choice. It was becoming something else entirely, a calling, a sanctuary, a mirror reflecting back what medicine, in its purest form, was always meant to be. Emily's story, as it turned out, wasn't rare. It was just one of many. In the months following her move, Stephen found himself fielding unexpected calls from old colleagues. They weren't casual conversations. These were late-night talks laced with frustration, doubt, and quietly spoken hopes. Friends who had once scoffed at the idea of studying abroad were now asking serious questions. Is it really true they still do cadaver dissections there? I heard their students spend actual time with patients, like real time, not just shadowing behind glass walls. Do they really still teach with values? Stephen would just smile and say, "Go see it for yourself." And they did. Soon, a ripple turned into a current. By the next academic cycle, the university in Cebu had seen a 20% increase in American enrollees, not exchange students. Full enrollees, young men and women choosing to complete their full medical degrees in the Philippines. Some came from families of doctors. Others had been rejected from American schools despite excellent grades. But what united them was something deeper. The hunger for an education that still honored the why, not just the how. One of them was Daniel, a bright but burned-out student from Texas, whose father had worked in the ER for over 20 years. Daniel had applied to over a dozen med schools back home. He'd done everything right. Volunteer work, internships, high scores. But he was waitlisted or rejected across the board. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because the system had become so impossibly competitive, It no longer felt fair. He arrived in Manila feeling like a failure. And yet, within weeks, he discovered something that surprised him. Nobody here cared about his rejections. Nobody treated him as less than. His classmates welcomed him not with judgment, but with joy. His professors gave him the same attention they gave everyone else. Slowly, the weight he'd carried began to lift. He found meaning in the smallest things. An elderly patient offering him boiled bananas after a home visit. A teacher telling him, "Don't memorize for the test, anak. Understand for the life ahead." And perhaps most powerfully, he rediscovered his own worth, not based on rankings or comparison, but on compassion. When his father came to visit, he was stunned. "This isn't just a med school," he told Stephen over coffee. "It's like a monastery in disguise. They're training healers, not just technicians." Stephen understood. He'd seen it before. He was seeing it again and again. But what really shocked him was what began happening back home. In hospitals across the U.S., Filipino-trained graduates were beginning to stand out. Not because they were louder, not because they had the flashiest resumes, but because of how they worked. They listened longer. They spoke gently. They made eye contact. And they prayed, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud, with patients whose families had given up hope. Hospital directors noticed, nurses noticed, even patients noticed. There was something different in the way they touched lives. And slowly, a new question began to emerge, quietly, reverently, and with growing weight. "Where were you trained?" "St. Luke's, Po." "University of the East." "Cebu doctors?" Some smiled in surprise. Others nodded in awe. Because these weren't just medical schools anymore. They were becoming beacons, not for luxury, not for fame, but for soul. Stephen kept all this to himself for a long time. He didn't want to romanticize it. He knew the Philippines wasn't perfect. The facilities still lagged behind in some places. Bureaucracy could be slow, the heat unrelenting. But he also knew what he saw. He saw students who didn't crumble under pressure, because their training included suffering, not just simulation. He saw young doctors who didn't see their careers as trophies, but as missions. He saw something in his daughter's eyes that no ranking or accreditation could ever replace. Peace. And he began to wonder, what if the future of global healthcare wasn't in the gleaming towers of the West? What if it was here, in these islands, in these schools, in this ancient rhythm of faith, humility, and community? He began writing about it. Quietly at first, blog posts, conference remarks, a small talk at a medical symposium. But every time he spoke, something happened. Another doctor would come forward and whisper, "My kid's applying next year." Another would say, "I wish I had studied there. I might have stayed human." And Stephen would nod. Because that's what it came down to, really. Not prestige, not profit, but presence. The Philippines wasn't just giving these students a degree. It was giving them back their calling, a calling to listen before prescribing, to kneel before diagnosing, to remember that medicine is never just about science, it's about soul. And so the movement grew. Not loudly, not in headlines, but in homes, in hearts, in hospitals across America where quiet revolutions were being led by soft-spoken doctors with warm smiles and a Philippine-trained hand. The kind of doctors who didn't just heal bodies, but reminded people that they mattered, that they were seen, that someone still cared. And it all began with a choice, a risky, unlikely, misunderstood choice, to study medicine in the heart of the islands, where faith still whispers through hospital hallways, where strangers still call you daughter, and where healing, somehow, still feels holy. Years passed. Emily graduated. Her white coat ceremony wasn't held in a grand auditorium or streamed live across social media. It was a quiet afternoon in a modest hall, the ceiling fans humming above a small gathering of professors, families, and classmates who had become family. When her name was called, she stepped forward not with the swagger of achievement, but with the humility of someone who knew the weight of the vow she was about to carry. Her father, Stephen, stood at the back of the room, blinking back tears. Not because his daughter had become a doctor, he always believed she would, but because she had become a different kind of doctor than he ever imagined, the kind he once was, before the system wore him down. After the ceremony, Emily pulled him aside and placed her white coat in his hands. "This is yours too, Dad," she whispered. "You gave me the courage to walk a path you never had the chance to take." Stephen didn't say anything. He couldn't. His throat tightened with pride, with grief, with something deeper than words. He simply held the coat against his chest, and for the first time in a long time, he felt healed. Emily stayed in the Philippines for her internship year. She worked in barangay clinics, slept on folding beds, walked through floods just to reach isolated communities. She got sick more than once. She lost patience. But she also delivered babies into the world, held the hands of the dying, and stood witness to lives that, though poor in possessions, were rich in spirit. She wasn't alone. By that time, over 100 other American students had joined her path, scattered across Cebu, Iloilo, Davao, Baguio. Some came with dreams, others came with doubts. All of them left with something they didn't expect: clarity. Clarity about why they wanted to heal in the first place. And as their stories began to trickle back home, something began to shift in the hearts of American families, especially those who had seen the cost of chasing prestige over purpose. Mothers who once boasted of Ivy League dreams now spoke of the quiet strength their sons gained in the provinces of Luzon. Fathers who had once dismissed foreign degrees now told friends, "My daughter learned more about humanity in Mindanao than I ever did in Boston." And patients, the ones lying in cold ER rooms and crowded wards, began to notice too. "Where are you from, Doc?" "I trained in the Philippines." The reactions were always the same. A pause, a look of surprise, then a quiet nod. As if that answer carried something more, as if somehow being trained there made the doctor see them differently, not as cases, but as people. It wasn't a trend anymore, it was a quiet revolution. Hospitals started asking different questions, not just, "Where did you study?" but "How do your patients feel around you?" Residency programs began to notice that Philippine-trained students often came with better bedside manner, stronger clinical instincts, and a surprising emotional intelligence that couldn't be taught in textbooks. In time, Stephen wrote a book. It wasn't a bestseller, but it made its way into the hands of the right people: deans, policymakers, thought leaders. Its title was simple: The Other White Coat: What American Medicine Forgot and What the Philippines Remembered. He toured it in medical schools across the U.S., standing before rooms filled with tired young faces, and every time he'd ask them a question. When did you stop dreaming of helping people and start dreaming of just surviving this system? The silence that followed always told him the answer. Then he'd tell them about Emily, and the janitor who called her Hija, and the old woman who pressed her palms to Emily's forehead in blessing, and the professor who said, "Take care of your mind," and the patients who offered boiled bananas and prayers instead of payment. And every time, something would flicker in their eyes. Hope. It wasn't about geography anymore. It was about rediscovery. The Philippines had quietly reminded a generation of future doctors that medicine is not just a career. It is a calling. One rooted not in power, but in presence. Not in knowledge alone, but in compassion. Not in speed, but in stillness. And in that way, the island nation had done what the richest systems in the world had failed to do. It had kept the soul of medicine alive. Stephen visited the Philippines one last time, years after Emily had returned to the States to complete her residency. He walked the same university halls, spoke to new students, and thanked every professor he met. On his final night, as the sun dipped behind the coconut trees and the sky turned that deep, flaming orange only the tropics know, he stood on the rooftop of his hotel and looked out at the city lights. He remembered the first time he came here, the doubts, the questions, the unfamiliar smells and sounds. And then he thought of his daughter, of who she had become, and of all the American students now walking the same path. He smiled. Sometimes it takes leaving home to finally find your way back to what matters. So if someone ever asks, "Why are American doctors sending their children to study medicine in the Philippines?" maybe the answer isn't so complicated. Maybe it's because in these humble islands, amidst the noise and kindness and faith, they found something America had forgotten. Not better tools, not better buildings, but better hearts. And isn't that where healing truly begins? If this story touched something deep in you, if it made you question, reflect, or simply feel proud, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more powerful, untold stories from the heart of the Philippines. Stories that remind us who we are and who we can still become. And in the comments, tell us, what does true healing mean to you? We're listening. We're building a community. And this is just the beginning.